A couple months ago, I had the privilege to talk with a patient who had traveled from out east to spend some time with a friend here in California. And she came to see me. And she explained to me that she had been somewhat distressed by the fact that a few weeks before, while taking a shower, she had noticed a lump in her armpit. Being very afraid of conventional strategies, thinking that this possibly could be cancer, and just not wanting to go there, just wanting to avoid that possibility, she came to me. So I knew what my job would be. My job would be to help her embrace, detecting, becoming aware of what's really going on. Because when we start avoiding what might be, we oftentimes miss the opportunity to find healing. And I told her the story of Norman Cousins, which I've told here before in this 12-week series. But in a nutshell, Norman Cousins had been diagnosed with a terminal illness. But he recognized what his job was, and so he had said to his physician, he says, "What are my chances?" And the young doctor looked at him and said, "Well, it's terminal. You need to get your life in order." And Norman Cousins had once again repeated himself. He says, "Doctor, I want to know what my chances are." The young specialist still did not understand the question, and once again tried to explain to Mr. Cousins that he had a condition that was incurable. To make a long story short, the physician had finally gotten the message and had gone to the medical library and found a study that showed that only 1 out of 500 people with that diagnosis survive. And downcast, he walked in once again to Norman Cousins' hospital room to share with him this bad news. And he explained to him that only 1 out of 500 could survive such a condition. To which Mr. Cousins quipped, says, 1 out of 500, I'm going to be that one. And again, the doctor tried to calm him down. He says, no. He says, you need to stay here and just then take the medications that we recommend. He says, why would I want to stay here because in a place where I'm being told I'm going to die? So the end of the story was that he had purpose in his heart to embrace the diagnosis. To not defy the diagnosis, but to defy the verdict. You see, the biggest part of healthcare, of finding ways to optimize our health, of finding ways to optimize our potential for healing, is to embrace the diagnosis. Find out what's missing. Find out what's wrong. And that can lead in some very unexpected ways to healing. So as I shared this with Anne, I could tell that she was not fully convinced. She had been told to get a CT scan. She didn't want to go there because she just knew what she was going to be told. She'd done her research, a little bit of research, suspected maybe it was a non-Hodgkin's lymphoma or maybe a form of breast cancer. And she didn't want to hear what her options would be. But I suggested, hey, just do that. Find out what's going on. And in the meantime, let's do a broader evaluation of your health. Let's do a comprehensive evaluation of your health. Let's find out what you can start doing right now. Let's find out things that you can fix right now. Things that invariably interrelate with whatever you're most concerned about right now. Well, it took a little bit of coaxing, a little bit of encouragement. But a few weeks later, she had all these tests done. And I'm going to share with you in a few minutes what we found out about those tests. Well, I'll share the first part. The CT scan came back essentially normal. The lump in her underarm ended up being a lipoma, just an abnormal fat growth that was totally benign. That happens. People get them on their backs. People get them rarely other places of the body, in the neck or other places. But many people get them on their arms, just little lumps that are just abnormal fat stores that if they're disfiguring in any way, they can be removed, popped out. One of my roommates, when I was attending Loma Linda University, he was a sophomore medical student at the time. He came home one afternoon where we were studying at the table. There's 9 of us that roomed in this home. And I said, what are you doing? He says, well, I'm just going to cut this lipoma out. He'd gone to his father's office, who's a physician in town, and gotten a scalpel and gotten some lidocaine and gotten some, everything he needed to take care of himself. So right there in the kitchen table, he shot a little bit of lidocaine around this 2-centimeter lipoma on his forearm. A couple of my other friends who are now hospitalists up north, they looked at him and said, what are you doing? He says, how do you know you're not cutting a nerve? How do you know you're not? He says, I ought to be all right. He just cut a little slash in his arm, popped out that little fatty tumor, ripped it right out, just kind of like Velcro, tore it right out, and then sewed himself back up. No problem. Half an hour later, he was in the garage working on his car. So lipomas are common, benign, fatty tumors, but sometimes they really scare people, right? They wake people up. They say, oh, what's going on here? But that benign condition gave Anne, which is not her real name, by the way, gave Anne an opportunity to step back and evaluate her health in a comprehensive way. Don't let me forget to tell you the rest of the story. I have a bad habit of forgetting to do that. So just wave your hand if I get towards the end and I haven't told you the rest of the story. Okay, let's take a look at the first slide. And it's essentially, last time that we met, we talked about what the most important health strategy was. And we had this it was a philosophical discussion about what constitutes the most important health strategy. We talked about various of these famous 8 natural remedies: good nutrition, regular exercise, optimal water intake, sunlight, optimizing vitamin D, avoiding smoking and alcohol, daily exposure to fresh air, clean air, proper rest and sleep, forgiveness and trust. And I made a strong case for one of these factors being critical to the success of the others. You can watch that again if you're not sure which one this is. But today, I want to concentrate on another equally important question. And that is, what is the best way to initiate and motivate an effective wellness program? We've been talking about the strategies, But how do we actually initiate and motivate and maintain an effective wellness program? Those of you who've been listening to these sessions over the last few weeks have heard my story when I was 24 years old. Remember, I used to think I was Mr. Fitness, kind of Mr. Health. I was a young man. I was fit and thought I was really healthy. But I had never taken the time to actually evaluate my internal health. I'd taken the time to evaluate my physical health, right? I had done these physical fitness tests that involved all kinds of different fitness tests, and I worked hard on a regular basis to be above 90th, 95th percentile in every category. That was my all through college. That's what I did. I just worked hard at fitness. And I assumed as a young man that being fit meant that I was healthy. But it wasn't until that fateful day in 1984, at the young age of 24, when I just happened upon a free cholesterol test, that I discovered that there was an inconsistency between my view of my health and what my body actually showed upon medical testing. Found my cholesterol was 244. It was not only high, but there wasn't even a part of the graph that represented how high it was. For somebody in the early 20s, I was completely off the chart. Well above 99th percentile. And you never want to be above even 75th percentile in any kind of medical test. At least most of them. Some of them you want to be high, some of them you want to be low. You never want to be average. You want to be optimal. We want to have optimal health. And so this is a critical question. What's the best way to initiate and motivate an effective wellness program? And that brings us to the title of today's presentation. Best lab test to maximize your healing potential. Right? It's all about maximizing our healing potential. Feeling well now, but maintaining and optimizing our potential to be well into the future. So what are the best ways to assess this? What are the best ways to test for this? And I want to give a comprehensive view of that today. But let's do a little philosophizing first. It was Jesus who one day he was being followed by huge crowds. And why was he being followed by huge crowds? Because for the first time in many decades and centuries, there was somebody that was speaking with authority. Somebody that was speaking like no other man had spoken before. Somebody that was speaking truth to a thirsty people, to a people who had grown up in a society where there was a lot of truth, but it wasn't real truth. It wasn't deep, profound truth. And so one day as he saw these crowds, he turned to them and he said, suppose one of you wants to build a tower. Won't you first sit down and estimate the cost to see if you have enough money to complete it? He loved causing people to really think, what is he talking about? Where is he headed with this information? Of course, there was a Jewish proverb that said, plans fail for lack of counsel, but with many advisors they succeed. A well-known proverb that had been written hundreds and hundreds of years before Jesus' time. Plans fail for lack of counsel. I'd like to suggest to us today that when we fail at our wellness program, that's because we're not planning properly. It's easy. It's easy to plan improperly or to not plan at all. Because we think, well, I'm just going to start following some of these strategies, right? I'm just going to do this, I'm going to do this. But we don't have a real sense of what's going on and what the real problems are. How can you stay motivated in a program if you don't really know your baseline assessment? I'd like to suggest to you that that's one of the most important things. It was Seneca, a Roman orator, who said it's part of the cure to wish to be cured. Got to really want it. And if you really want the cure, you have to be willing, like Norman Cousins did, to embrace the diagnosis, which means let's find out what's really wrong. Let's not ignore the testing. Let's not ignore the diagnostics. Let's find out what's going on, and then we defy the verdict. And that's the exciting part. That's the part that I love to participate in, helping people defy the verdict, helping people reverse disease where possible, optimize their health. So the first step in properly understanding and then treating the main causes of disease is assessment, which is embracing the diagnosis, figuring out what's really wrong. Where are the gaps in my journey of wellness? Where are the potholes that can trip us up, that can injure us along the way, that create barriers for healing, that promote disease unless they are discovered and addressed directly? And you see, each one of us have multiple potholes in front of us. We all do. I do. Each one of you sitting here, each one of you watching on the internet, understand or should begin to better understand that there are many gaps and potholes in your road of life, in your journey towards wellness. And our job is to find out what those are. Another Jewish proverb is, do your planning and prepare your fields before building your house. In other words, do things in the right order. Don't set yourself up for failure where you're doing really good, you're moving forward, and all of a sudden, because you didn't realize what you were dealing with originally, you fail. Of course, we've all heard the phrase by Plato, know thyself. And that's where I want to start tonight, by looking at some genetic testing opportunities. I believe that the science is now available to be able to provide profound personalized care if we take advantage of genetic testing. We're going to go through some of that tonight. There's actually a whole presentation that was done with Dinner with the Doctor. You can see on YouTube. Just type in to YouTube, Wes Youngberg, genetics, and you'll see that entire presentation on genetics and why it's important to test. But essentially, we have 20,000 genes. We discovered in a previous session that up to an entire third, or 7,000 or more of these genes, are profoundly influenced simply by how well we sleep. We need to understand our genes, and now we're at a time that we can learn specifically about our genes. So let me share with you some concepts about genetic testing. Interestingly enough, Cicero, one of my favorite quotes from Cicero, he says, old age must be resisted and its deficiencies supplied. As we get older and we discover that we are no longer as nimble and agile and strong and quick to come up with names and information as we were when we were younger, is that just an inevitable part of aging, or is there something going on as we age that is contributing to this that we can actually modify, that we can control based on a better understanding of our unique self, and that is through genetic testing. And so it's exciting for me to share with patients this concept of nutritional genetic bypasses, where by understanding what gene has been mutated, right? And we all have genetic mutations, many of them, potentially countless mutations. We all have them. They're just different for each one of us. And so by understanding where that mutation is, by recognizing the biochemical pathways in the body that are well established, we can determine exactly what nutrients relate to that enzymatic pathway that is not working optimally because of that genetic mutation. That's exciting. That means that now we have all this additional control over our genes that we didn't have or we didn't think we had previously. So bad genes must be detected, be resisted, and its deficiency supplied. And I'd like to expand on that a little bit by saying that dysfunctional genes, which we all carry, must first be detected, then supported holistically. In other words, broadly, not just by understanding where they are on that biochemical pathway, which is another way of saying nutritional pathway, right? Every biochemical pathway is influenced by nutrition. But understanding the overall context of all the natural strategies, all the factors that we've been covering in this 12-week series, and how they help you optimize that genetic dysfunction that you carry, or I should say genetic dysfunctions, plural, that each of us carry. So, dysfunctional genes must first be detected and supported holistically, and finally nutrigenomically bypassed in order to supply their nutrient deficiencies. This is a new paradigm that we've moved into. So let me share with you just a couple concepts, because there's a lot of things that we need to cover today. One of the genes that is reported by some scientists to be the most exciting genetic or genomic discovery since the Human Genome Project was completed in 2003 is the finding of this methyl tetrahydrofolate reductase gene, this MTHFR gene, that when mutated significantly changes your potential to detoxify, to heal damaged DNA, to prevent viruses from replicating. Those are three critical things that we need to consider if we're going to be healthy into the future. But it addresses many other factors. We could spend hours and hours just talking about that one gene alone. But here's the concept of genetic testing. You can have a single copy mutation, which is 1 plus and 1 negative. On the screen, you see the MAOA gene that has 1 plus and 1 negative. That means you have one mutated copy from one parent and one normal copy from the other parent. When you only have one mutated copy, that means that yes, there is some dysfunction. And when it comes to the MTHFR gene, that represents about a 40% dysfunction in the ability of that enzyme that's coded by the gene to activate folate, the vitamin folate, or to methylate it. But if you have a double copy MTHFR, that increases the risk of the tendency to a dysfunctional enzyme anywhere from 70 to 90% total. Significant. But we know exactly how to nutritionally bypass that. The COMT gene mutation has been referred to as the warrior gene because that mutation actually prevents the normal breakdown of stress hormones. So that catecholamines and stress hormones tend to stay elevated in the body longer than they normally would, and that makes people more impulsive. They stay in that fight or flight reactionary mode longer and at a higher level. Therefore, the name warrior gene. It's simplistic, stereotypical, but this gene mutation tends to increase that hot reactor tendency that we might have. Now, a critical principle in gene testing is that one gene does not make a person. Having one mutation or one normal gene doesn't determine who you are. Okay, we have 20,000 genes, and so it's the interplay, the interrelationship between all the genes and how they are expressed or deactivated epigenetically that really makes the difference. And then finally, I want to mention the VDR gene mutation. This is the vitamin D receptor gene. And there's various of these genes that actually determines how easily vitamin D can activate the nuclear genetic information and extracting information to help fight viruses and bacteria and cancer. And so if you have mutations in the vitamin D receptor gene, that means we have to even more emphasize the importance of vitamin D for that person. So these will give you some examples of how we use a few of the many genes available on various genetic testing platforms like 23andme.com, where you can get a comprehensive gene analysis for $99, just online on your own. There's many other options as well. So the very first risk factor that we discussed as we looked at ways to optimize our genetic potential in our first session, I shared with you the research by Dr. David Levy, who a renowned physician, PhD researcher, who did a very interesting study. He did what was called the Archimedes study, where he took a mathematical model that was extrapolated from the work of Archimedes, and he did a computer-simulated study with a large group of individuals that had participated in a government program called NHANES. It's a National Health and Nutrition Examination Study. Every 10 years, we're looking at many, many thousands of people participating in a very comprehensive study. And so they took all these people and they put all the characteristics into a computer and then simulated a 60-year study from age 20 until age 80. And what they did is they simply controlled one risk factor to optimal for the entire 60-year period, and all the other risk factors were allowed to take their normal course over time. So the question they were seeking to answer with this study is, what are the most profound risk factors that influence the number one killer and the number one cause of disease in the world? Which is what? It's heart disease, cardiovascular disease, circulatory disease. And remember, problems with circulation means you can have problems in any organ, in any tissue of your body. So cardiovascular disease is really the main cause and the main factor that damages just about any organ system in the body. So this is critical. If we don't fix circulation, we are not going to be healthy. And we're going to be prone to disease and premature death. So the question is, which of the risk factors, after being fully controlled, had the most impact at preventing heart disease? See, these are practical questions, because there's all kinds of things. You know, we could spend $1 million on health testing and still be scratching the surface on the potential tests that we could do. So we have to somehow determine what's the most prudent way to go about health testing to give us information that we can instantly utilize in developing our wellness program and emphasizing strategies that uniquely and specifically help control that risk factor based on good medical evidence. And so let me share with you what Dr. David Eddy discovered in this study. So take a look at the slide here. It says, so essentially, the family history, which is important, that's part of the initial assessment, is to know where you came from, right? Is to know your gene pool, to understand the medical history and the cause of death in your parents, grandparents, etc., siblings, cousins. That's very valuable insight as to what might be going on in your own body. But even that only accounts for 4% of our risk for heart disease. Isn't that good news? Okay, if we come from a family like I do, I come from a family that has a tremendous high risk of heart disease. My grandfather died of a massive heart attack the year before I was born. My uncle, a physician in the ER, died of a massive heart attack in his 50s. I'm paying attention. Okay, but I don't pay attention just thinking, I just need to be a little bit more careful with my diet. I need to exercise a little bit more. I want to really understand my risk. How do I do that? So family history is good to know, but it only accounts for 4% of our risk. Next is fasting blood sugars. Fasting blood sugars, I'm big on that. I think it's critical that we understand our blood sugars before breakfast. But you know that fully controlling fasting blood sugars for 60 years only accounts for 9%. If that was the only thing that was accounted for or controlled, it only reduces cardiovascular disease by 9%. The same thing with smoking. Wow, that's a shocker. Not smoking just prevents 9% of heart attacks. So, see, some of us would think, well, I don't smoke. I'm good. No, we're not good just because we don't smoke. It's important, just like family history is important, but we need to understand the proportionality of risk. It's wise not to smoke, but don't think that in of itself protects you enough, because it doesn't. Controlling your LDL cholesterol, there's so much emphasis today on getting that cholesterol down. Understandably. But fully controlling the LDL, the bad cholesterol, lowered the risk of heart attacks, controlled only 16% of myocardial infarctions or heart attacks. As we move back, now, the HDL cholesterol, the good cholesterol, the healthy cholesterol, the cholesterol that literally sucks that bad cholesterol out of the artery wall and takes it back to the liver to be detoxified and removed from the system. Now we're starting to look at some big numbers. That controlling HDL for 60 years basically prevented a full 1/3 of myocardial infarctions, of heart attacks. Now let's look at the two big ones. Controlling the systolic blood pressure. That top number that represents how high the pressure in your circulation goes up when your heart is contracting. Controlling that completely at youthful levels for 60 years represented a 36% lower or control of heart disease. But the one factor that beat all of those was correcting insulin resistance. If you've been paying any attention at all during this 12-week series, you're starting to get an understanding of how critical insulin resistance is. 42% of all heart attacks were prevented by just controlling insulin resistance. So we're going to be looking today at what the lab tests are, the best tests that address insulin resistance, that help us understand our risk and then get motivated to really work hard at addressing that risk factor and seeking to reverse it. So let's take a look at these at these factors that relate to insulin resistance. First of all, we know that the vast majority of individuals that have, all diabetics, all pre-diabetics essentially have insulin resistance. But I suggest to you today that the majority of people with insulin resistance have neither diabetes or pre-diabetes. They have resistance and to the insulin, so the pancreas makes a tremendous amount of insulin to offset the tendency to high blood sugars. That extra insulin controls the blood sugars. That's why a fasting blood sugar, as important as it is to test, is a very poor predictor of the underlying problem. It's not sensitive enough. It doesn't catch the problem early. That's why checking a blood sugar at 2 hours after a sweet drink or a starchy meal is far more sensitive in catching not only diabetes and pre-diabetes, but in catching the underlying insulin resistance. If you're between the ages of 40 and 59, 1 out of 2 of you already have at least pre-diabetes. If you're between the ages of 60 and 74, 2 out of 3 of you already have at least pre-diabetes. And if you're 75 years or older, 3 out of 4 of you at least have pre-diabetes. And that's still the tip of the iceberg. That's still not accounting for that mammoth ice flow under the ocean surface that accounts for the real drive of insulin resistance that's promoting cancer, that's promoting hypertension. So a lot of those conditions determined by the Archimedes study were actually being caused by insulin resistance as well. So high insulin will cause high blood pressure. High insulin will promote low HDL, high triglycerides, and high LDL. High insulin will promote changes in blood sugar up and down, which drive us to cravings and oftentimes drive us to continue to smoke or participate in other unhealthy activities. So that's why we need to really figure out this insulin resistance side and figure out how to reverse it. Another test that we can use to establish whether we tend to be insulin resistant is the hemoglobin A1C test. And we'll look at that a little bit further. That's a test that looks at how much your blood sugar spikes after each meal. And remember, if the sugar is spiking after the meal, sticking to things and measurable, that means that your body's having to produce extra insulin to try to control that blood sugar. And it's that high insulin that then drives the risk of heart attacks, strokes, cancer, and so forth. There are 5 stages of high blood sugar that we can look at that's available on page 90 of the book Goodbye Diabetes that help us see where we're at in these stages. We don't have to even have pre-diabetes to know that we have early signs of high blood sugar. Stage 1 and stage 2 high blood sugars are not even quite yet to the pre-diabetic level. And so these tools, educational approaches to understanding our risk are critical. Do you know where you fall in these 5 stages of high blood sugar when you're fasting before breakfast, 1 hour after a starchy meal, or 2 hours after a starchy meal? Or better yet, 1 and 2 hours after your favorite sweets or candies. Take advantage of looking at that. So the question is our pancreas producing all this extra insulin that now becomes both good and bad news? The good news that the pancreas is controlling the blood sugar, so we don't have prediabetes or diabetes yet, or potentially, but what's the cost? The cost is all that risk for all those other diseases that we talked about. If you're already taking insulin because you have diabetes and you need, at least for now, insulin to control your blood sugars better, we can do a C-peptide test. We only do that for people who are already injecting insulin to see if there's a chance for you to be able to minimize your insulin medications in the next month to 3 months. The good news is that the vast majority of patients that I see who are taking insulin, when I give them the C-peptide test, the amount of C-peptide, which approximates, actually it equals the amount of insulin that's being produced, tells us specifically whether or not the pancreas is still healthy. If the pancreas is still healthy, that means that by getting on the right program, following the right strategies, can dramatically help reverse that diabetes or prediabetes. In this case, diabetes. So an exciting test. And if the C-peptide is very low, at least we can be frank with the person and says, you will still probably need some insulin, at least for some time. But see, the point here isn't getting off medications. The point is how to optimize our healing potential, how to minimize our risk of a heart attack or kidney failure or amputation or blindness. Another key several tests are cardiac CRP, which is inflammation. We'll look at that a little bit later. Iron and ferritin, the storage form of iron, ferritin, should be measured in everybody. It's not part of the standard physical. It's not part of most blood tests that are included in a standard blood testing protocol, but I think it should be, everybody should get this test. Why? Because many people either are low or high. If you're too low on iron, that is placing you at risk. That alone can cause depression. It can cause fatigue and many other symptoms, but a high iron can cause diabetes, can cause heart attacks, can cause plaque to form into arteries, and can cause cancer. So you want to know. And I could tell you story after story of people who literally, by being willing to test broadly, have uncovered those key potholes that would have caused their early demise if they hadn't learned about it. Easy to fix once you learn about it. We had a whole session on vitamin D. I won't say too much about that tonight. But I have frequently told patients, I said, even if every single other test that came back was completely optimal, even if we hadn't learned anything about how to improve your health further except optimizing vitamin D, that would have been worth the entire expense, the entire hassle of doing all that comprehensive testing. Vitamin D is critical. There have been several studies in medical journals in the last few months appearing to dramatically decrease the importance of vitamin D. But one of the first things I learned in studying statistics, the little book that was called How to Lie with Statistics. All you got to do is alter your method, and you can pretty much show whatever you want. If you're not giving enough vitamin D in your vitamin D study, don't expect good things to happen. If you say you're on an exercise program and we do a study for 10 years and find that exercise had no impact on your risk of a heart attack, the news that would come out after that study would be regular exercise program absolutely ineffective in helping and prevent any level of heart disease. But if we would have asked you how many days a week you exercised and how many minutes you exercise every day. And you would have said, well, it's 5 minutes once a day, once a week. It's a little bit of help, but is it going to make a lasting difference? See, so that's, you have to be very critical of studies that contradict 30 years of well-done research previously. Be real careful with that. Other tests that I think are extremely valuable are having a complete thyroid panel. Not just a thyroid-stimulating hormone that is actually not even a thyroid hormone. It's a pituitary hormone. It's a hormone that's trying to tell the thyroid to make more thyroid hormone. And so when that thyroid-stimulating hormone starts to climb above 2.5, that suggests that something's out of balance. Once it climbs above 5 or so, or 4.5, depending on the lab range, that suggests that there's a more serious concern. And as it gets closer to 10, that's very, very serious. But that number can be very deceiving. We need to look at the actual thyroid hormones and see if they're okay. The free T4, the free T3. Then we need to look at the thyroid antibodies. Is your body producing antibodies that are fighting the thyroid? Come back to the story of Anne. Just a few days ago, I had a chance to sit down with her by phone, because she lives on the East Coast, and go over all the labs that she had done a month ago. As I looked at the labs, the first thing I saw was her CT report that her physician had sent to me. And of course, it was just a benign fatty tumor in the armpit. So that she was ecstatic. Her temptation was to just, we're good, we're done. It's nothing. I can go on with my busy life. Busy executive, you don't have time to. But she'd done all these tests, so okay, so let's go through her tests. And as I looked at her tests, I was impressed by how many potholes she had. I get excited when I see the potholes. Why? Because those are opportunities. See, they've been there all along. You can keep falling into them, keep getting injured, crawling back out of them if you can, or we can fill them up. We can remove them as an obstacle to your health. I get excited about helping people see what's really going on, the hidden causes of disease within. And as I looked at her chart, everything was out of whack. Her thyroid was out of control. Her thyroid antibodies, which are supposed to be based on that lab under 60, were nearly 1,000. She had no clue. Now, I've seen much higher, but she had no clue there was anything wrong with her thyroid. The only reason she had those labs done is because she thought that this mass here, and she took my advice to test broadly. She was, one of the typical people that I'm not going to get labs unless they're absolutely necessary, trying to avoid unnecessary medical procedures. But in doing so, most people avoid learning what they need to know to establish a powerful strategy to reverse the condition. So the thyroid stimulating hormone was almost 10. Out of control thyroid, antibodies super high. The actual thyroid hormone was low. The reverse T3, the inactivated form of thyroid, very high. So I told her, I says, you need to discuss this, number one, with your primary care doctor, and I'll work with you on looking at the big picture, right? Because as you know by now, I'm a big believer in everybody having a team, a board of healthcare providers that they rely on to give good feedback and information, but ultimately who's in charge, right? You or I. We are individually, personally, in charge of our own board of health. And if we choose not to be, we're not going to get better. We're putting ourselves at serious risk. So thyroid is critical. We could spend hours on that. The comprehensive metabolic profile, the CMP. It gives us a lot of information, and that is on every physical, usually every physical. It gives a broad review of systems. Good thing to look at. A complete blood count, looking at white blood cells, red blood cells, etc. How the immune system is doing. Another good thing to be on, and it's typically on all lab orders done for a physical. Homocysteine is not typically done as part of the physical, even though it is an important way of helping us understand our potholes, our missing elements. Homocysteine is a protein in the blood that, if elevated, significantly increases risk broadly for all kinds of conditions. Looking at B12 and folate. If you're already taking vitamin B12 and folate, it's probably not going to help that much. But if you've not been taking any supplements, it'd be good to see, where are you when you don't? How low is that? And we know from many good university studies that if you're in the low normal range of vitamin B12, you have a dramatic increased risk for Alzheimer's. That should be reason enough to pay attention to B12. But B12 has far more influence on our health than just addressing brain health and Alzheimer's. We've already talked about the MTHFR gene mutation. We've been looking at that hemoglobin A1C, that where the blood sugar is spiking after meals. How often is that happening? How high does that go? That's what the sticky blood sugar test, hemoglobin A1C, tells us. And you'll see that normal is between 4% and 5.6%. Actually, that's not the normal. The normal goes way higher than that. But bottom line is you want it to be at least under 5.7, which is the beginning of pre-diabetes. And diabetes, type 2 diabetes, or even type 1 diabetes, can be defined as a level of 6.5% or higher. So the more sugar sticks to cells when it spikes after meals, the more damage that's done. And that represents a serious risk factor for compromised circulation, for compromised kidneys, for compromised in our eyesight, in our nervous system. Optimal levels are 5.0 or a little bit less. I find that most people, the vast majority of people, are not at 5.0 or less. Most people are somewhere in between optimal and pre-diabetes. And again, we already know the numbers for how many of us are pre-diabetic. If we're over 40, chances are we're at least pre-diabetic. We know that every 1 point that hemoglobin A1C lab test goes up above 5, each 1 point represents a 35% increased risk of nerve damage, a 35% increased risk of vision loss, kidney disease, and a 25% risk of premature death. Each point that you go up above 5. And so that's why you can only imagine the excitement and the joy that is found in individuals who just 3-4 months ago were told that their level was 10 or 11 or 12. And now just a short 2 to 3 months later, they're at 6 or better. How did they do that? They did that by first embracing the diagnosis, of recognizing what their problem was. And instead of saying, well, it's too far gone now, I'm just way out of control, I probably have irreversible damage, recognizing that the body will heal itself given half a chance. It's exciting. It's exciting to see that. And so then as we've shared several times previously in this series, we're looking at the standard lipid profile. Just looking at the total cholesterol, the LDL cholesterol, the HDL, the triglycerides. Important tests that we know relate to cardiovascular health, but they only represent about 50% of our risk of having a heart attack. All together, they represent only about 50% of our risk. So that's why we need to go beyond the standard cholesterol or lipid profile and go into what we call the advanced cardiovascular risk factors that include the plaque test, that PLA2, the plaque test, which actually measures the chemicals being released, the enzymes being released by cells in your artery wall that are plaque cells. That's a valuable test. And every time I see that, I can see that frequently elevated in patients that have completely normal cholesterols. Everything else seems to be okay, but their plaque levels are high. That means that there's specific inflammation in the vascular bed. The artery wall itself is inflamed, diseased, and is plaque-ridden. Do you want to know? If you had that, would you want to know? You see, things we don't know can hurt us. Things that we continue to avoid learning about will hurt us if they're a risk factor. The exciting thing is that those are all reversible, completely reversible. The high sensitivity CRP, or the cardiac CRP as it's also called, is another general test for inflammation that we've talked about several times, recognizing that if both of those are elevated, now we're looking at an 11-fold increased risk of stroke. See, most of us don't realize that the standard test that we get in a physical, the lipid profile, the CBC, the metabolic profile, they actually have very little predictive value for TIAs and strokes. They have predictive value for heart disease, but not strokes. The plaque test has a predictive value for stroke directly. So does the other measures of inflammation. So we want to be taking advantage of these tests as we move forward. And if they're all normal, then we don't have to address them, except every so often repeating them, right? But if they're elevated, that's when we, basically roll up the sleeves and develop a plan based on good science to reverse that process. Then we look at the CRP test. We don't want to just be normal. On the lab, it says 1 to 3 is normal. But if you look at the Harvard studies, once your level is above 1, you've already reached above 50th percentile. So that's not good. You want to be, I don't ever want to be average risk for a cardiovascular risk factor. Why? Because it's average to have heart disease. That's why. It's average. It's expected. Right? And so if it's a risk factor in a disease that's expected, I should do the test early and reverse as many of the risk factors as I can now. So we want to take advantage of the Harvard criteria and try to keep that level of inflammation as close to 0 as possible. Never be satisfied with normal between 1 and 3. Normal or average risk is high risk. And of course, the plaque test is actually showing us that there is present right now atherosclerotic plaque inside the artery wall. So, and then there's 3 other tests that are included in the advanced cardiac profile. It's the sticky LDL cholesterol, the Lp(a). It's so sticky that it dramatically increases the tendency for plaque formation, and it is in part a genetic risk factor. In other words, once we find that, we know that we're going to have to work on that probably for life. But there's good natural strategies that we can follow for that. And then the small dense, the SD-LDL, that's the very tiny, small package of LDL cholesterol, the bad cholesterol. You see, cholesterol comes in all sizes. You got larger, fluffy LDL cholesterol particles, and then intermittently smaller and smaller packages of LDL. You don't want to have the small package. That small package is so tiny that it can actually cross right between the gap junctions of healthy cells right into the artery wall, causing irritation and damage. You want to have what's called the fluffy puffy, or the pattern A LDL, the larger, better formed form of LDL. And then the ApoB is the way the rest of the world addresses cholesterol. All around Europe and other places of the world, they look at the ApoB because there's an ApoB molecule on every bad form of cholesterol. There's all kinds of bad forms of cholesterol. And so it kind of gives you an aggregate. I had a patient this morning who had cholesterol was a little high, but it wasn't scary high. But their ApoB, that molecule that was present, one molecule in every bad cholesterol particle, was more than double the limit. That was worth discussing and getting more aggressive about. So those are the advanced risk factors. And finally, with regards to cholesterol, is the HDL. Not only, as we learned from the Archimedes study, not only is that the most important part of the lipid profile to be elevated, to be protective, there's also a more specific form of the protective HDL, and that's called HDL2, HDL2B. And that needs to be at the right level, or else that's an independent risk factor for heart disease. So those are all factors that we can look at. Now let's look at a couple more genes. Two more genes that powerfully help us understand a person's individual or personalized risk for cardiovascular disease, and in the case of the apolipoprotein E, or ApoE for short, Alzheimer's. If we have one copy of that gene mutation, the ApoE4, which is a mutated form, should be ApoE3. If we have the ApoE4, one copy of it, and one normal copy of E3, that means that we can have anywhere from 2 to 4-fold increased risk for Alzheimer's. But if we have two copies of that gene, that risk just went somewhere from 5-fold to 34-fold. I want to know. And I've helped people who were positive with that gene recognize their risk now and then get aggressive about fixing all the other things that influence Alzheimer's disease. It's good news, right? What would be bad news is to find out 15 years from now, oh, by the way, you had that gene, that's why you have such high risk. Really? Why didn't somebody tell me this 20 years ago so I could have prevented it? And we know that it's largely preventable, way over 90% preventable if we know what the issues are. That's exciting. So the ApoE, and then finally we have the factor V Leiden. This is a test it's a gene test that tells us whether or not you have a tendency to blood clots. And this is one of the blessings that I was given this year, is by doing the advanced cardiovascular risk factors, I discovered that I had this gene mutation. I had a mutation in the factor V test, which makes me much more likely to develop clots, to throw clots, to get a pulmonary embolism, a deep vein thrombosis. Is that something that's important to know? Absolutely. And there's very simple natural strategies that we can follow to address those risk factors. Okay, and so there's various other tests that we can look at. One additional cardiovascular risk factor, which we will discuss more when we address kidney function and how to address chronic kidney disease and how to prevent it and even potentially reverse it into earlier stages, is having protein in the urine. Now see, the kidneys are designed by our Creator to hold on to protein. Protein is like currency. Protein is like very valuable. It's what makes life happen, protein. If we didn't have protein, the body would cease to work. Everything is built on protein blocks. So we don't want to just be flushing protein down the toilet. So the kidneys, which filter 20% of all our blood every minute, so 20% of all the protein that's in our bloodstream is being filtered through the kidneys every minute, and the kidneys are responsible for keeping the protein. But if the kidneys have been damaged by high blood pressure, by high insulin levels, by high blood sugar levels, by high cholesterol levels, and so by oxidative stress, by autoimmune conditions, etc., if they keep being damaged collectively by all these factors, what happens is that filtering system becomes damaged and scarred, and it allows things to leak through that should not leak through. That can largely be prevented and corrected by addressing all these factors and all these strategies that we've addressed. So, if you have protein loss in your urine with a simple urine test, that is a significant cardiovascular risk factor. And that will be discussed more later. Another interesting study done in 2008 and published in the Archives of Internal Medicine showed that women who had the thyroid stimulating hormone just slightly above 2.2 or below 1. In other words, it's a very tight range. The normal range goes all the way up to 5 or so in most lab ranges. But if they're above, these women were above 2.2 on the thyroid stimulating hormone, that doubled the risk of Alzheimer's. That's an important study to understand, and one reason that we want to optimize thyroid, not just be satisfied with what is average. Remember, average is not necessarily healthy. Another test is homocysteine. Homocysteine that we mentioned briefly earlier needs to really be, in the healthiest populations, is around 7 or so. And we know that if it's less than 9, that's generally protective, generally adequate. So let me tell you a quick story of Luke. Luke, at the time, was 74 years old. He was ex-Navy SEAL. In fact, he was proud of the fact that he was part of the Navy SEALs before they were called SEALs. He was a frogman. And he was one of these unique, gifted soldiers that not only had the physical strength and stamina, but he had very keen eyesight and hearing, so much so that his troops that he was in charge of would always follow him because he could hear things first, he could see things first. So they felt the safest behind him. And so he was a wonderful man, but by the time I saw him, he had had multiple heart attacks, multiple strokes. His blood sugars were sky high. In fact, his fasting blood sugar was running between 400 and 500. His hemoglobin A1C was at 13.4%. Every point above 5 represents a 35% increased risk for serious disease. His homocysteine was 45. I mean, he was a metabolic nightmare. And I could tell by looking in his eyes that he had no hope. We did the stimulated C-peptide test. Anything above 4 suggests there's up to a 95% chance of reversing diabetes. He was on 200 units of insulin, with blood sugar sky high. He was out of control. And after this test came back, and I shared with him, I said, Luke, good news. Your pancreas is functioning fine. You should be able to make all the insulin that you need if you start paying attention to the strategies. Now, what do you think an ex-frogman, Navy SEAL, somebody who had been one of the fittest in the world, as soon as he learned about the possibility of reversal, he embraced it. He said, well, you know, I got shrapnel all up and down my back. They can't take it out because it's so close to my spinal cord. He says, I start walking and I seize up because shrapnel's right there in my back, and I seize up and I can't move. He says, but I've learned that if I just kind of, just adjust myself a little bit, pretty soon it unlocks and I can walk another few minutes. He says, I can't walk for 20 or 30 minutes at a time, but I can walk 5 minutes at a time. And I can do that 5, 6, 7, 8 times a day. You know that he completely got off 200 units of insulin. He brought his blood sugars down to 100 before meals and 140 after meals. He brought his hemoglobin A1C dramatically down by more than half. Gave him many more years of a healthy existence, no more depression, no more fatigue, because we addressed the cause of his disease. So elevated homocysteine is just one example of being caused by a deficiency. This is a nutritional problem that is strongly related to that gene testing, the MTHFR gene mutation. It's a lack of nourishment, so that's why the strategies that we've been focusing on during this entire series so oftentimes focus on nutrition, because deficiencies is what cause the majority of these problems and why digestion is so critical. We need to emphasize that. So as we talked about in the first few sessions, there's principles of setting limits. There is the whole concept of sometimes having to say no to things we really want to do or really like to do in order to say yes to the very best of things. But it's important to recognize that our exposome, all those things in our lives, our environment, the choices that we make physically, emotionally, attitudinally, they influence our potential for epigenetic change. We know about nutrigenomics. We know about the main causes of inflammation based on the Harvard study. We know what foods are most critical, those colorful foods that come from nature that actually are able, by their colors, their pigments, to change our genes. We know that our attitudes have a huge influence on current and future wellness. We know that we're born for joy. And ultimately, we recognize that setting limits doesn't mean that we're limiting joy in our lives. What it means is it's dramatically, exponentially increasing the potential for joy in our lives. If you show me somebody that never sets limits in their lives, I'll show you a depressed, damaged person. If you show me somebody that has been able to prudently, consciously set appropriate limits in their lives, I'll show you a person who's happy. I'll show you a person who's satisfied with their life. So enjoy each day in a way that gives you even more joy tomorrow by thinking about this appropriately and recognizing that by following all these strategies, by taking advantage of this first step, this most critical step of actually testing, being willing to embrace the idea of assessment, you can get a new direction in your life that will take you where you want to be. And finally, as we've said many times before, remember that you are the chairman or the chairwoman of the board of your health. Don't let anybody else take control of that position. Thank you.
Very interesting. We want to take some questions, and we invite those here in the audience to come up to the mic if you have a question that you would like to share with Dr. Wes Youngberg. The first question is from Susan, and she asks, my 22-year-old daughter and I, 56, both test positive for the mutant folate gene. She has one of each. Is it possible to take a methylfolate without multivitamin? Test. We eat a plant-based diet with lots of colors.
Okay. All right. So that's a great question to emphasize the point about genetic testing and what it means. So the context of this question is that I think the daughter or one of them has one copy of each. Now, that is suggesting that they have a copy of what's called the 677 gene mutation and one copy of the 1298 mutation. That's actually what would be considered the worst combination. The combination that increases the dysfunction or the impairment to that enzymatic activity in the body that detoxifies and repairs. It increases that dysfunction up to 90%. That's a huge hit on something that happens in every cell of your body and its attempt to detoxify and repair DNA and suppress viral growth and so forth. But here's the great news, is that by understanding that, then we can nutrigenomically bypass it. And that's where the folate, the whole food folate, or more accurately, the methyl activated form of folate. There are some multiple vitamins that will give you anywhere, generally up to 1,000 micrograms of methylfolate. However, with somebody who has double copy, it was called the compound heterozygous mutation of MTHFR, they would most likely need to go well above 1,000 micrograms of methylfolate. So they start with a good multiple that gives 1,000 of methylfolate, 1,000 of the methylcobalamin, the methyl B12, the N-acetylcysteine, which is a detoxifying nutrient in the liver to optimize glutathione. All those things are important. That's the base. Okay, but they're probably going to have to go higher in the methylfolate and methyl B12 and some other factors. And there is a 5-page handout on dealing with MTHFR on my website, dryoungberg.com, in the lab section that can be downloaded free. That kind of overviews methylfolate in particular. The other context here is that it's good that she's eating a plant-based diet. It's good that she seeks to address all these other factors, all the strategies that we've been focusing on, which deal with digestion and deal with detoxification and dealing with autoimmunity. We want to find out not just about the double copy mutation of MTHFR, but how does that relate to everything else? Okay, so it ups the ante on the importance of paying attention to all the other gaps. So as we fix the other gaps in our metabolic pathways, that will help improve or limit the risk associated with that very important double copy mutation.
Okay, thank you. We have a question from our audience. Salim will be sharing with us.
Welcome
Thank
back
you.
from the Philippines.
That's what I was going to say. I was going to bring a praise report with a group that have been watching you with me live. And I don't know if they're watching right now, but I just want to say greetings to them. I just came back yesterday. So I came as fast as I could to come here and meet with you guys. Because this should have been the last meeting. I don't know if there's going to be other ones. But that was at a public level, your praise report. A praise report at a private level is that during the time that I was in the Philippines listening to you, I went down on my inner organ lipid count, and outwardly I could tell that people can see that from those that know me, from 30 pounds that I was overweight, now I'm only 12 pounds over my upper ideal weight. So following some of your strategies, I'm doing well. Thank you very much.
Oh.
God bless you.
Good to see you, Salim.
Likewise.
Great. Congratulations.
We have another question from our audience. Evan will be sharing with us.
A few weeks ago, you talked about activated charcoal.
Yes.
And so we got some, but we don't know how much to take. And maybe you just get a little overview of the benefits of activated charcoal.
Okay, so activated charcoal is the one natural medicine that I would want to have with me going on a trip anywhere, whether it's in the United States or outside of the United States. It is something that invariably anybody who has it would use it and benefit greatly, dramatically decreasing the risk, especially of gastrointestinal discomfort, gastrointestinal flu. You can knock that out in an hour if you catch it early enough by just taking a heaping teaspoon of the powdered activated charcoal and mixing it in about 4 or 5 ounces of ice cold water. Add a couple ice cubes to make sure it's nice and cold, and that way it'll go down a lot better than if it's, lukewarm or room temperature. It'll taste really chalky if it's regular temperature water. But the ice cold charcoal, what I call the black shake, actually goes down pretty nice and can be used as a detoxifying tonic once a week or even more often. But especially if there's something going on. Remember, toxins are the initiating inflammatory cause of heart disease. Okay, so you don't hear about this very often, but if you talk to anybody who understands the medical literature, the top researchers, that's the initiating cause of heart disease. Toxins are inflammatory and what lead to, I believe, the majority of disease. And so we need to pay attention to toxins and how to help the body naturally deal with not only toxins that we're exposed to from the outside, but as we discussed in the lecture on detoxification, the majority of toxins are created inside our own body.
Is it you take it every day or just
Yeah, I would not take charcoal every day unless there was a problem. I will be sharing an exciting story and research study from Vanderbilt University in this session on preventing and reversing chronic kidney disease because it's a major factor leading to heart disease. If people with kidney disease don't realize of it, that's dramatically increasing the risk of heart disease, which is the number one killer.
I have time for one more question, and this comes from Janice. Is there a need to go through a detox 5 or 10-day program if one has a health issue?
Short answer, sure, yes. Now, we need to explain or clarify what kind of detox program there is, because there's thousands of different strategies on detoxification, and sometimes that's where detoxification gets a bad rap, is how we go about detoxifying. I think, again, we need to be prudent in our approach. We need to use an effective method, a method that makes sense. And, of course, everything that we're addressing, all the different systems that we've been talking about in our program are ways to help improve the body's natural detoxification approach. So I frequently will tell a patient, in fact, I told Ann when I spoke with her a couple days ago, as I looked at her labs, and let me finish the rest of that story right now. As I looked at her labs, she had advanced prediabetes. She felt fine, had no clue about any problems except for that lump in her arm that ended up being nothing. But now the additional testing showed advanced prediabetes, insulin levels that were sky high, 10 times higher than they should be, thyroid that's out of control, autoimmune conditions, not just with thyroid, but a high level of the anti-nuclear antibody test, which means that the immune system's attacking the cell's nucleus, the genetic material. We could go on and on. She had all kinds of things going on. And so that was all a serendipitous blessing for her simply because she found that lump. Okay? In other words, let's not wait until we're scared that we have cancer or we're scared that we have some serious, potentially incurable disease. Let's not wait for that. Let's test now. Let's figure out where we're at and seek to prevent. Okay? And when we find a problem, seek to reverse dramatically. Was there another part of that question that I didn't get to?
No, that was the last question. But before we leave, we want to share with those watching online and those here in the audience that June 30th at 7 p.m. we will be having a cooking class right here in Fallbrook. And it's going to be by Karen Houghton, RN, and also author of Naturally Gourmet. And so it's going to be happening here June 30th and also July 7th.
So if you want to learn how to not only make healthy food, but food that really tastes good, that's why you want to come. That's good stuff.
And when is our next meeting, Dr. Youngberg?
We'll be sending out emails on that.
Okay,
All right, thank you.
thank you.